Welcome to Morning Bible Stream. I'm going to be starting to do these streams. I'm going to start to do them regularly where I read a passage from the Bible and then talk about it a little bit, just sort of give a reflection and perhaps some thoughts. So yeah, why don't we just get right into it? All I've been doing for this, I didn't pick out a passage beforehand, so I didn't want to have too much of a scripted thought plan for what I wanted to say about the passage. But what I went ahead and did is I just opened up to a random reading this morning, and the one that I opened up to was in the Psalms. So if I can just remember where the Psalms are here. I opened up to Psalm 79, and it was a prayer for Jerusalem. So, we'll go ahead and do our reading, and then we'll sort of stew on the reading a little bit and think about it, and then I'll have a little reflection. Psalm 79. A prayer for Jerusalem. A psalm of Asaph. O God, sorry, I have to readjust my grip here. O God, the nations have invaded your inheritance. They have defiled your holy temple. They have laid Jerusalem in ruins. They have left the corpses of your servants as food for the birds of the sky, the flesh of those devoted to you, for the beasts of the earth. They have poured out their blood like water all around Jerusalem, and no one is left to do the burying. We have become the reproach of our neighbors, the scorn and derision of those around us. How long, Lord, will you be angry forever? Will your jealous anger keep burning like fire? Pour out your wrath on nations that do not recognize you, on kingdoms that do not call on your name. For they have devoured Jacob, laid waste to his dwelling place. Do not remember against us the iniquities of our forefathers. Let your compassion move quickly ahead of us, for we have been brought very low. Help us, God our Savior, on account of the glory of your name. Deliver us, pardon our sins, for your name's sake. Why should the nations say, where is their God? Before our eyes, make known to the nations that you avenge the blood of your servants, which has been poured out. Let the groaning of the imprisoned come in before you in accord with the greatness of your arm. Preserve those doomed to die. Turn back sevenfold into the bosom of our neighbors the insult with which they insulted you, Lord. Then we, your people, the sheep of your pasture, will give thanks to you forever. From generation to generation, we will recount your praise. So that's a really cool song. As you can see, that's the end of it. That's a really powerful psalm. A beautiful reading right there. A really moving and powerful prayer for Jerusalem. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and turn the camera toward me, and I'm gonna go ahead and talk about this reading a little bit. This is a really, there's a lot of passion in this prayer. There's a lot of, there's a lot at stake in this prayer, right? Now bear with me as I turn the camera here. Hey everyone. Good morning or afternoon to those for who it's afternoon. I hope that everybody's doing well. Okay, so let's talk about Psalm 79 here. First of all, I just want to walk through it and sort of discuss what are we really talking about here, right? Um, so this is the Psalm 79, right? Is a prayer for Jerusalem. Um, the nations have invaded your inheritance. So the person here is saying that the secular nations of the world have come into what is owed to God, right? So whatever powers that be in the world are beginning to encroach upon what God has laid out for his people, basically, is what it seems like, right? Um, and the people have defiled the holy temple and laid Jerusalem in ruins. So there's really a sense of desperation here. Um, hello, also Gloria. I hope that you're doing well this morning. There's a sense of desperation here, and so Jerusalem is in trouble, right? And there's really intense language about this. They left the corpses of your servants as food for the birds of the sky. Wow. The flesh of those devoted to you for the beasts of the earth. They have poured out their blood like water all around Jerusalem, and no one is left to do the burying. We have become the reproach of our neighbors, the scorn and derision of those around us. So what I'm getting out of that when I read it is when they're saying they, the psalm is still talking about the nations of the world that he says are invading the inheritance of God, right? So he's saying they are killing God's servants. They are leaving them for food. Now it's interesting to me when he says that they pour their blood out like water. I'm not sure if that means that they were fighting or if that's supposed to mean something about, that they were changing the land, or that, there might be some significance with the fact that they're, sort of pouring out a part of their own body over the land, right? And Mark, good morning to you as well. I hope that you're having a good day. I'm a Catholic myself, or I was raised Catholic. I consider myself a Christian. Now let's see here. So that's the first section of Psalm 79 here. So Psalm 79, it's got 4 sections. The first part is laying out the fact that there are foreign nations that have come in and more or less taken over Jerusalem, and they have invaded the land, and they're taking God's inheritance from his chosen people, right? So they believe, and the next passage sort of begins to set out how they believe that they are being punished, and that's why this is happening, right? So the second passage goes on to ask God if he will be angry forever with a jealous anger. And the jealous anger is a big motif of the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, God is very often depicted as being jealous of other gods. And a large part of that, we believe, is because of how Abraham's monotheistic religion arose out of paganism in an era when many gods were very common to have in a religion. So the jealous God of the Old Testament is a very common image. But what's interesting here is that Jerusalem seems to be the one that's being punished, right? So usually when that happens, it's because Jerusalem was engaging in some kind of false idolatry or something like that. And Jamia Weatherspoon, good afternoon to you as well. And yeah, there is a lot of history in the Bible. There's a lot of stories in the Bible that we believe actually do correlate to historical events for sure, like the exodus of the Jews from Egypt. So, in the second passage here of Psalm 79, getting back to the topic at hand, the person writing the psalm and praying to God is asking God to pour his wrath out on secular nations that don't recognize, or not secular, I guess in this time it would be pagan nations, really. He's asking him to pour his wrath out on pagan nations that don't recognize God's name. And they're begging God, they're saying, help us and lay waste to these others who have hurt us, who have come into Jerusalem and hurt us. And forgive us, essentially, for the fact that the people who came before us weren't perfect and that they messed things up. This line actually reminds me a lot of the Our Father. This second line in in the second section of Psalm 79, Asaph says, "Do not remember us the iniquities of our do not remember against us the iniquities of our forefathers." Right? So that language is actually somewhat similar of forgive us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. It's not in direct correlation or anything, but there is at least some kind of parallel that I'm getting out of that. Asking God but this is interesting because in the Our Father, right, you're asking for personal forgiveness. In this situation, Asaph is actually asking God to not hold against them what their forefathers did. So that's very interesting. He's asking God to be compassionate because he's essentially asking for lenience. He's saying we were in a very low time, and then you came and you helped us, right? Okay, so let's read section 3 one more time together, and then we'll talk about section 3 in particular. Help us, God our Savior, on account of the glory of your name. Deliver us, pardon our sins for your name's sake. Why should the nations say, where is their God? Before our eyes make known to the nations that you avenge the blood of your servants, which has been poured out. So, again, Asaph, the writer of this psalm in particular, is asking God for help in this section of the psalm. It seems somewhat straightforward to me, honestly, this section, but there probably is more going on in there that I'm not aware of. But actually, really, Asaph is asking for vengeance in this section of the psalm. He's saying, our servants have been killed and scattered, and we need you to avenge them, God. Okay, so now, section 3, I don't have a lot to comment on that one. So let's go ahead and reread section 4, and then I'll see if there's anything that sticks out to me in that one. Let the groaning of the imprisoned come in before you, in accord with the greatness of your arm. Preserve those doomed to die. Turn back sevenfold into the bosom of our neighbors the insult with which they insulted you, Lord. Then we, your people, the sheep of your pasture, will give thanks to you forever. From generation to generation, we will recount your praise. Let the groaning of the imprisoned come in before you, in accord with the greatness of your arm. Preserve those doomed to die. That is a very interesting line. That's 2 lines, and that's 3 lines, that's all one sentence. Let the groaning of the imprisoned come in before you, in accord with the greatness of your arm. Preserve those doomed to die. Preserve those doomed to die. Very fat. That's a really deep. That seems to be a deep cut to me. In accord with the greatness of your arm. Here, I'm going to put the camera back on the Bible so we can all look at this a little more closely together. How about that? Let the groaning of the imprisoned come in before you. In accord with the greatness of your arm, preserve those doomed to die. Turn back sevenfold into the bosom of our neighbors the insults with which they insulted you. Then we, your people, the sheep of your pasture, will give thanks to you forever. From generation to generation, we will recount your praise. Wow. So, I really want to dig into these first 3 lines of this 4th section. Let the groaning of the imprisoned come in before you, in accord with the greatness of your arm. Preserve those doomed to die. The groaning of the imprisoned, in accord with the greatness of your arm, preserve those doomed to die. So what is Asaph, the psalm writer, really saying here? Who are the imprisoned? And who are those who are doomed to die? I believe that the imprisoned is self-referential to the Israelites and the writer of the psalm. And that the psalm writer Asaph with this line again is asking for protection from God. And that the psalm writer is asking God to essentially hold them in their arms and preserve them, even though they are doomed. That's what I believe that this is getting at. But that's a beautiful psalm. And like many others, it sort of depicts a state of desperation. It depicts a state of, destruction and despair, more or less. It has a lot of, bodily imagery in this one. There's a lot of food and there being, corpses. The corpses of the servants is a really vivid image in this psalm. Leaving them as food for the birds that's not something I commonly see when I'm reading around in the Bible, is something violent like that. So the author is obviously really, really trying to get across that there is some pretty bad stuff going down, that Jerusalem is in a very bad state here, right? The people of Israel, God's chosen people, are being looked down on. They're being spat on. So it is interesting to me, though, when they ask God if he will continue to be angry, as if he's taking it out on them when bad things happen. Because in the New Testament, when people think about God, or when people pose their ideas of God, it's often a very, very compassionate and God who's concerned with limiting the amount of suffering that the believers have, right? So in the New Testament, people often assume God is always going to reduce the amount of suffering of a given person, right? But in the Old Testament, they often assumed that God was punishing them actually, and that God was upset, and that bad things were happening because they had broken their promises to God. So that's a very common belief that has morphed a little bit through the echoes of religion and Christendom. That whenever bad things were happening, it would be assumed that you know there was a reason, that the people had done something wrong and that God was punishing them. And that goes all the way back into paganism, way far back too. And it's only in a more recent New Testament mindset that someone might say the bad thing happening isn't being caused by God for a reason, but God could be a way for you to relieve yourself of that suffering. So, a little bit of a different framing of God that you get in the Old Testament and the New Testament for sure. Well, this is a beautiful psalm, and it's a great one to reflect on. There's lots of really great psalms, and generally the psalms are some of my favorite readings. They tend to have much more energetic language. They tend to be a little more punchy. They tend to be a little more challenging, in my opinion. The Psalms often depict desperation. They often depict someone who is at their wits' end, and they often depict someone who's just begging from God for any kind of help. And for one reason or another, I find that to be a very powerful way to connect with God through the Bible. So, I don't know who Asaph is, but something else that we can do here to dig into this a little bit more is that we can go ahead and read through some of the notes on Psalm 79 here. Okay, so why don't we do that? I'll go ahead and read through some of these notes here, and we'll see where that leads us. Okay. Oh man, my camera is like a little bit tilted maybe. That's fine, it's gonna be really hard to fix it right now. Okay. So, Psalm 79, the notes. A communal lament, complaining that the nations have defiled the temple and murdered the holy people, leaving their corpses unburied. Oh, so that's what the significance about leaving the corpses of the servants is. It's very, very serious that your remains have to be buried within Judaism. That's also important within Catholicism, but not to the same degree. In Judaism, if you were not buried properly, I believe you kind of are like doomed to a bad afterlife or something. Sorry, I don't know that very specifically. So, the notes go on to say, the occasion is probably the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonian army in 587 BC. Okay, so this likely actually does relate to a historical event in which Jerusalem was destroyed. And it's not just an analogy of spiritual distress, right? This is also what's cool about the Psalms, is that they will just be historical sometimes too, um, and just be about, you know, something crazy that happened in the past, right? So, the people, so the occasion is most likely the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem by the Babylonian army, okay? Um, and then the people are asking, they're in a state of desperation, right? And they are wondering when divine favor will return. They had been experiencing some good times, right? And now Jerusalem has been laid waste and destroyed. So they're wondering, uh, when is God's favor going to return? You know, when is God going to start taking care of them again? They pray for action. 6 to 7. Pour out your wrath. And then they admit that their own sins brought the catastrophe. So that is the do not remember against us the iniquities of our forefathers, and give us compassion because we have been brought very low. Let's see here. They seek to persuade God to act for reasons of honor. The nations who do not call upon the name are running amok. So that is interesting. They appeal to a sense of honor to God to say, well, the people who don't recognize you, the people who scorn you, the people whom theoretically you should dislike the most and whom you should seek to do, you know, put out, and whom you should not be seeking to promote, they're all doing great. So why don't you put them out, God? Why don't you take out those people who owe you nothing, who have given you nothing, and who don't even recognize you or give you any respect? Why would you allow them to run amok? Right? Is basically what they're asking. Which in a certain sense is also along the lines of saying, hey God, we promised ourselves to you and we've done this for you. I know our forefathers messed up, but we're doing what we can. So how about you help us out here? Is almost more or less, right, like what the psalm is saying. And I like how the Psalms say things like this. You know, someone could look at that and say, oh, well, the Israelites are really just asking for quid pro quo from God or something ridiculous like that, right? They're just saying, we give you respect, so give us protection, right? They're like, someone could look at that almost as a transactional sequence. But in reality, the Israelites are just asking for what they need, and within the way that they understand it, right? So there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with having intent to take care of yourself or take care of your people. That's natural and that's a good thing. And God wants us to take care of our communities and ourselves. And God doesn't want us to be selfish, right? God doesn't want us to only care about promoting ourselves and collecting resources and securing comfort or whatever it is that we would like to secure. But you know, God also is there for our wants and needs. You know, we should be voicing our wants and needs to God, without not reservation, but without feeling as though wanting something itself is a bad thing, or wanting something good for yourself isn't a bad thing, right? So it's good for the Israelites to want God to take care of them. It's good for the Israelites to expect that. They should expect that. So when bad things happen, they have to wonder, well, you know, why have we lost favor with God? Did we do something wrong? You know, God, please protect us again, is really all they're saying. So I just had a thought about how that could be looked at negatively, as if the Israelites are just sort of almost being selfish and just asking God to constantly take care of them and to wipe out other nations and to make their battles victorious. Um, but uh, selfish isn't really how I would depict that, I guess, is really all that I'm saying. Because it is ultimately a good thing to want good for yourself. But ultimately, most people would say that the goal for a Christian person is to evangelize, actually. It's one of the fundamental goals for most Christians. And in that sense, one of your major goals is to seek the good for others, and to bring them into the religion, right? And to show them God and to give them a chance to get their souls into heaven. That is probably one of the ultimate goods in the eyes of a modern Christian, I would say. To bring another person to heaven is one of the best things that you can do, right? But in the mindset of a Old Testament Jew, probably one of the best things, it's similar, right? It's very similar, but it's slightly different, right? Really the best thing that you could do was preserve your community, right? If you were a Hebrew, you lived in a very hostile environment. You were a monotheistic person following a basically new God that no one had ever heard about before under Abraham. And everyone else is pagan, and they don't like your new God, and that you're claiming that he is better than yours. And the Hebrews were also beating people in battles a lot and taking over territory. So they're really a contentious group that catches a lot of heat from all sides. There's a ton of conflict for the Hebrews throughout the Old Testament. They're always fighting, and they're always jockeying for territory and trying to find the promised land, right? So basically, context actually does matter for what is good, I believe. So what was good for the Israelites was self-preservation and the promotion of their community against very, as they were depicted anyways, very, immoral societies. So nowadays, we would look at that situation and probably seek a diplomatic solution, right? It wouldn't necessarily just be a existential conflict of nations, as it was with the Hebrews and many other groups. They wiped out many groups, basically, utterly and entirely. The Canaanites were almost completely obliterated by the Hebrews, from what we understand. So the Hebrews basically did fight wars of elimination, more or less. When they fought people, it was to destroy them. And that was because of how existential the problem was for them. Just like this Psalm 79 is depicting, the moment that a larger force comes along and someone is able to overcome and, take over Jerusalem or defeat Hebrews and where they live, then that is what they do. And they do it with absolute impunity and impatience. So the Babylonians, the Assyrians, whoever it is, they will come in and they will wipe out Jerusalem and just destroy everything, obliterate it. So, historical context is important when we're assessing, these Psalms and what we, oops, I kicked my camera. It's really important when we're assessing the Psalms and how we think about, the morality that's at play here and what we're supposed to get out of, the morality that's being depicted in this kind of Bible passage. We don't necessarily deal with physical existential threats like that a lot anymore. We don't necessarily deal with, other nations. Now, some people do. Please don't get me wrong, um, but there's not as much um, warfare or possibility that your nation will be uh, destroyed unless you still are, Israel or Palestine. And unfortunately, all of those conflicts, which were in this Bible passage that we're talking about right here this morning, which was written thousands of years ago, they're still going on today. So the Bible is always relevant. But for Jews who are living in Israel, and Palestinians even, they could probably read this Bible passage and directly relate to it, which is pretty incredible. It's kind of sad, but it does speak a lot to, it speaks to that there is actual truth within this book, right? There is really, there's something to it. So, the Jews who live in Jerusalem, the ancient Hebrews in this passage, are facing an existential threat. They have had a foreign nation come in and wipe them out and defile their homeland, right? But even after that, they ask for revenge, right? And they say, after God, you turn back the insult, then your people, the sheep, they say they will give thanks forever. From generation to generation, they'll recount your praise. So, in a lot of ways, I think you could look at this as very transactional, right? Where they're saying, help us out, God, and then we will be loyal to you. We will be loyal to you and give thanks to you for this if you help us out with this, right? But it doesn't actually say if. It just asks for it, and then it says, then we will. We will recount your praise from generation to generation. It means a lot to me that the Israelites are willing, or how it sort of depicts actually truly how dependent the Israelites were on God. This to me, God delivered them from everything. The only reason that they appear to have survived or flourished is by the hand of God. So they owe everything to God, and they know it. And so even when they're basically upset with God themselves, and they're saying, hey God, where did you go? Why did you let the Babylonians come in and wipe us out? Even when they're in that mode where for many reasons they should be very upset and in a state of desperation where it would be easy to sort of cut yourself off from God and say, I don't want to talk to you right now, God, because you let people, walk over me like a mat and destroy my homeland, which is what would be going on in this passage, right? Even when they're in that state of being so angry, they still say, but God, please just help us out and let's go back to what we had, right? Where we were praising you and being good, and we're sorry about what our forefathers did, but please get these Babylonians out of here, help us again, and we are going to revamp our devotion to you. We're going to become, we're going to give thanks and recount your praise. So, we're going to double down on our glorification efforts, right? And in the Old Testament, there almost is this, there absolutely is the pattern of the Hebrews making a covenant with God, and then because they're humans and they're imperfect, like we all are, and they were living in insane circumstances in the ancient times, right? Where life now is so much more comfortable and easy than it was back then for many different reasons. Um, but the Israelites, they they were desperate many times, right? And they did need God for so much, and really felt as though God delivered them so many times. So it's you know I think it's meaningful that the loyalty that the Israelites have to God, right? It's almost a loyalty out of necessity. And that's something that if you look at modern times and people who are practice religion nowadays, um, I don't think that desperation exists in the same degree. I think for some people it does. I think for some people who have had life conversion events where their life was really hard, and then they found God and they were able to stabilize their lives and get into a better position. I think for people like that, they probably do see their relationship with God in a similar way. Um, but for almost nowadays, it's almost all a mental rejuvenation. It's really not a direct physical protection that God now offers, or a financial gain that God offers. It really, in my opinion, it really more now Christianity in in the broadest sense would focus upon the spiritual rejuvenation of it, right? So obviously the Israelites, they have spiritual rejuvenation through their covenant with God as well, but there's more of an element of practical matters of here's your manna from heaven, here's your water from your rock that you need or you will die, right? It's really more directly like two physical needs, the old covenant, whereas the new covenant is a little bit more directed toward purely spiritual needs. Now, they both do both, right? The old covenant has spiritual and practical physical elements. I'm just sort of discussing as it comes up in my head a little bit of a comparison between the old covenant and the new covenant, and how they treat uh, the physical care of the temple of your body and the spirit that resides within that temple, right? So the old covenant, I would argue, is just a little bit more concerned with actually caring for the structure of the temple, your body and your community and your nation, even. Whereas the new covenant is a little more focused on maintaining the Holy Spirit of God that resides within all of us as our soul, the part of God, right? Which, not saying we're part of the Trinity within the Catholic sense of that, but saying that God gives life to every person and He creates each of our souls, and in that sense, the soul comes from God, right? And it can almost be conceived of as it's like it's kind of made from the same stuff as God, right? That's sort of how I think about it. That's not an official teaching. That's just sort of how I think about it. So there's lots to get out here, right? There's there's so much meaning to find even in just a little simple, what seems like a simple psalm like this, Psalm 79. There's historical context to this. There is religious context of the differences of, between Judaism and Christianity in the modern sense. When we look at this psalm and we read it now, we read it with expectations and understandings that the people who wrote it did not have whatsoever. So, what God says through this passage back then is going to be different from what God is saying through that passage now because of who is reading it. The person who read this 500 years ago, would have a different context to understand this passage through their lives, right? But what's beautiful about it, and what's beautiful about the truth as it's revealed through the Bible, is that it can be absolute still and do that. So, someone can get one message or another from the Bible, or they can hear slightly different things, but they're still hearing the truth of God. I like to relate to the Babel story and the story of the many tongues for that. So for the story of many tongues, the apostles give a speech, and it's heard by all people in the crowd from all over many different nations in their own tongue, right? Now, if you think about that for a minute, there's no way that what every single person heard was different, right? Every single person who was listening to Peter talk on that day heard him talk in their own mother tongue. So they actually heard different words. They actually heard, different sounds, right, than the other people around them did. So they would have received slightly different messages, right, as far as the exact words that were the messages. But ultimately, they all still received the truth of Peter's message that day, which was a message of the gospel of the Lord, right, that Jesus had been resurrected. But what's interesting, right, is that even though everyone heard the truth of what Peter was proclaiming, they actually heard different things, right? So, like, the same way two different people reading the Bible, one person could read this passage and have different thoughts about it, and then another person could read the passage and have similar but different thoughts, and yet they both are receiving truth, a divine revelation through the passage, right? So there's even if you understand a passage differently from someone else, it's likely that you both are picking up on elements of what God is trying to reveal through the words, right? So that is to say, not necessarily that all interpretations of the Bible are valid, because I don't believe they are, actually. I do think there are better and worse interpretations of biblical passages. There are better and worse interpretations of biblical passages, but there still is, for any passage, I believe, a range within which you can interpret it that is reasonable, but that doesn't necessarily change, the divine revelation within the passage. But some people would look at things and really try to change what's just being said, right? They really want to mess with the words, and they just want things to actually say something that they don't a lot of times. So sometimes people will try to pull things out of the Bible that just are not there at all, right? And we have to be careful about that ourselves anytime we're reading the Bible. Confirmation bias is strong, and it's sneakier than you think also. If you have something that you want in your life, or something you feel like is going wrong, and you turn to God for help with those things, you're going to look for answers that God is providing, right? You're going to want to look for a solution to those problems. And that's a good thing. But the confirmation bias issue can come in when,
we sort of want a quick fix or like a flash bang sort of like solution, right? Where we're suddenly hit by a meteor and then everything is better. And we're looking for this huge shift in our lives. And so we sort of that's a lot of times I think how we expect change to happen because of perhaps stories like the conversion of Paul and how he's knocked from his horse and then has an encounter with Jesus and then decides to become a great leader of the church, and convert many Gentiles to the church. So I think a lot of people think of change in that way. They think of spiritual change as being a very usurpus event in the sense that you have a state of wanting to be, and then you are very much knocked off of that and put onto a correct course, right? So and that relates to what I'm saying about confirmation bias, because when you are in a state where things aren't exactly right and you're looking for that solution to help yourself, a lot of times what people do is they turn to spiritual sources, they turn to inspirational sources, and they look for that sort of firecracker answer that's going to break them out of the rut that they're in, and that's going to put them back on track to being exactly where they want to go, right? And a lot of times people will, look to the Bible and to divine revelation for things like that too. They will look for God to be knocking them off their horse and setting them back on the right course. So the confirmation bias will sort of make us see things that aren't necessarily there sometimes. So, like the Jew in this passage, to relate it back to Psalm 79 again, the Israelites here are they're begging for change. They're begging for their circumstances to become better, and it's obvious in that passage, right? But what they don't do is they don't compromise their own morality through their desperation, I guess is what I'm saying. So when they seek help, they seek it directly from God. But I guess actually the Israelites do fall into the same problem that I'm describing here, because a lot of times what happens when you're looking for a big change and you're sort of seeking it out, is that you end up in a situation where you're actually basically worshiping something that's not God, right? Where it's actually an idolatry type of situation. And the Israelites were kind of infamous for this in the Old Testament, most particularly where they were worshiping the golden calf when Moses returns from Zion, I believe. Or wait, no, I can't remember. It doesn't really matter. But either way, when Moses comes back down from the mountain, the Israelites are worshiping a golden calf that they have created, right? They're worshiping mammon. They're worshiping wealth and comfort. And but what's often lost in that passage, I think, is why are the Israelites doing that? It's sort of depicted almost as something that's ridiculous that they do, that they make the golden calf and then they worship it. Well, they did make the golden calf and they did worship it. So there has to be some meaning behind that for why they would do that, right? And in my opinion, when people are desperate and they are looking for a way out of a bad situation, they will turn to things that aren't God almost without even recognizing it, because that thing is providing something to them. It's providing some kind of momentary comfort or relief from something else, right? So when the Israelites were down there waiting for Moses at the bottom of the mountain, they probably got pretty desperate and felt like, well, maybe Moses isn't coming back down at all. maybe this isn't going to work out. They probably had a lot of doubts about what was happening, and they felt comforted when they decided to turn to something else. So that's sort of where the risk lies, right? In that you can find a lot of comfort and ease in the moment when you're in a bad situation. You can find a lot of comfort and ease in something like just having money to be comfortable, which is what I would relate as an analogy to worshiping the golden calf. Why would I have to worry about not coveting my neighbor if I have more money than my neighbor? If I am more comfortable than my neighbor? Why would I have to worry about not murdering if I have so much money that no one can even touch me? That's like taking it a little bit far, and that was sarcastic, just to be clear. But the idea is that it's easy to turn to other things for comfort when we feel as though we don't have that relationship with God, or we've lost our relationship with God. And we often do these things without even realizing it, right? So the Jews, in my opinion, the Israelites, they made the golden calf because they were desperate, they were doubtful, and they were anxious that Moses wasn't going to come back. They believed that that if they worship something else, more or less, that at least they would have something, and they would have a comfort of having something to turn to. Although that is always depicted as and considered a very grave sin that the Israelites commit, right? But I think it's actually more common than we realize to be committing idolatry. And by idolatry, really, what they mean is putting other things above God. That very well might be what they're referencing to in Psalm 79 when they're talking about the iniquity of the forefathers, right? So the Jews and the Israelites, they're the same thing. I'm sort of saying them interchangeably. God's chosen people often didn't do what God wanted them to do, and they kept getting into trouble for it with God, and breaking their covenants with Him. Even though they lived in such a desperate situation constantly, right? So they needed God existentially to survive, right? For the Hebrews, it was not even a question of whether you turn to God in all these existential crises where the Babylonians are invading, the Assyrians are invading, another person's invading. Jerusalem gets taken over many times cyclically throughout Abrahamic or to Jesus in the history timeline. So the Jews are always looking for a positive change in their circumstances. They, just like many of us are now, right? And this is where idolatry is very dangerous. When you are in a desperate circumstance, you're willing to basically turn to almost anything to try and get out of it. And that's also where the confirmation bias comes in, right? So you oftentimes want a certain solution when you are in a certain situation. So for the Israelites, right, they want revenge on the people who have hurt them, and they want comfort, and they want God to take care of them. And God isn't always doing that, actually. Sometimes things are hard, and sometimes God is asking them to confront evil and to go through tribulation, and they do. So something that's very important to understand is that the correct path, the path that God actually wants us to walk, is sometimes and oftentimes a very difficult path. God oftentimes is not going to allow us to be comfortable when we are doing what ultimately is His will for us to do. So that's where I think the idolatry of mammon comes in a lot, where it's sort of assumed that if you are being good, that your reward is peace and comfort, right? That your reward is eternal peace and comfort in particular. But even when you're doing what's right and being good, sometimes things will still be really hard and things will still just be tough. And it'll feel as though, God isn't making anything easy for you, and that you're doing what you're supposed to do. So I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, so why are you making it so hard for me, right? Is, I think, a common question that people have for God, because oftentimes the right thing to do is actually really hard, and that's why we need God to help us. I think that actually might be an anchoring thought for this passage that I've read, is that ultimately we really are desperate and we do need God to help us, because there are enemies out there. There are people who want to hurt us. There is instability in the world. There is evil. There is evil out there. And there are people who will do bad things and take advantage of other people, simply because they can sometimes, and simply because they want to take care of themselves other times. Those things are out there. Evil is out there, and it must be confronted. And the only way that it can be confronted and defeated is through belief in God, and through God giving us His power to do that. So, this passage about the Israelites and their conflict 1,000 years ago, still so relevant to the conflict that we have today. Evil then is still evil now, right? It just changes forms and does different things. So I think ultimately what I would take out of the passage is I think, from all this discussion sort of that I've been going through, I think sort of my closing thoughts on this would be, it's a reminder that life is hard. There are things that are tough out there. And even when we have built up our station around us, and we have our temple and our beautiful nation and many believers and people around us that we love, and we feel as though we're in a good situation, all of that can come crashing down, and and can be struck down by either evil people or perhaps even just unfortunate events. And in the case that it does, it will be tough. It will be very tough, and you will be brought, like this passage says, be brought very low, right? But the important part is that even when they are brought low, the Israelites what they cling to is God, and their promises with God, and their faith in God, and the power that God has, and their belief that He will use that power to deliver them. Even when they're brought that low, they still depend on Him. Even when their country has been wiped out, and their friends and servants have been killed, and their bodies have been left out in the street, the most horrifying, evil event that you can imagine has occurred to Jerusalem and the Israelites. And in the wake of that, when they have been destroyed and brought down to almost nothing, and in their minds have been basically abandoned by God while this has happened, and God has essentially allowed this to happen because of the iniquities of their forefathers. Even when God stands by and allows this to happen, and how long will the Lord be angry, and how long will His jealous rage burn? Even when God's jealous rage burns on the Israelites and they are hurt by the nations that he usually protects them from, they still cling to their belief in God, and they still ask him to be their savior ultimately. So even when for reasons they basically don't even really understand, bad things are happening, the Israelites will still turn to God, right? Even when they believe it's God who is punishing them, they will say, look, please, forgive us now. They don't say, wow, look at how unfair God is. They just say, please help us with this situation that we're in. So there's definitely an attitude now that I know I have, probably many modern people have, to sort of almost expect more from God, to almost expect that God will make our lives comfortable and entirely take care of us, and put us at peace and essentially baby us and make our lives very comfortable. There's a horrible, there are horrible lies that people tell about how, if you have faith that God will make you wealthy and prosperous and things like that as well. So that's connected there, where there sort of is almost an expectation that God is going to take care of us more nowadays, even than there was, I think, in the Old Testament. And that's just sort of something I'm noting for my own curiosity, and I don't know how much that resonates with anybody who might be hanging out or listening, but it seems to me that we actually almost we seem to expect more from God now. We seem to expect that God will relieve our suffering more, or we seem to almost point the finger at God more and say that it's unfair when bad things happen. In my opinion, that attitude is more common. Although I believe it did exist, of course, in the Old Testament as well. And in the book of Job, I believe that is discussed a little bit, where Job is essentially never ever blaming God for anything and just taking everything on the chin. It's sort of a motif in that story, from how he does not ever blame God, I would say. So it's sort of almost indirectly discussing that. But I think in the beginning also, Job maybe does have a conversation about, why is God doing this? And he sort of almost just resigns himself to his fate. But I have to reread that book, actually, because I think my brief analysis of it right now might be a little bit inaccurate. And the book of Job is really deep and wonderful stuff, and just directly deals with human struggles of faith in times of trouble. It's one of the best books in the Bible. So I should definitely give that one a reread soon. And maybe that could be part of this live stream project as we work our way through the book of Job. That would be something that would be great to do. As of now, I was just sort of picking out a passage, talking about it for a while, just sort of giving my thoughts on it, having a morning reflection. And that's what we did today, right? So Psalm 79, a beautiful psalm depicting a time of tribulation in Jerusalem, likely when the Babylonians came and destroyed the temple and laid waste to a lot of people. And the Jews, are asking for redemption for their forefathers' iniquities, and for God to take revenge on the people who destroyed Jerusalem. So it's a very powerful psalm. It's very moving, and obviously it was generated in a time of great distress. So it's something, that can be turned to, perhaps, when you're having your own tribulations and personal troubles, and you feel as though perhaps there are enemy nations assaulting you, that you can perhaps reflect on this psalm and think to yourself about, what happened to the Israelites and how horrific, truly horrific it was. I mean, blood running down the streets, right? And even after something like that, as horrifying as that happening, the Israelites turn to God and say, please deliver us from this, and we will recount your praise and your glory. So I think for me, this passage really evokes a sense of gratitude, actually, and it gives me a sense of perspective. You know, the Israelites are saying, God, we will praise you and love you forever if you deliver us from an existential, life-threatening, evil nation that has come to destroy us. And in my life, I encounter evil in my life, and I have conflicts as well, but they simply, to me, do not compare to this kind of existential, life-threatening issue that the Israelites are dealing with. So for me, it gives me a sense of gratitude that God still loves me and cares about me and takes care of me in this modern age where I don't have to worry about my life like the Israelites did. I don't have to worry about my nation like the Israelites did, because I'm fortunate. Now, and some people do have to still worry about those things, and we pray for those people every day. But personally, I was just reflecting on the fact that it does bring about a sense of gratitude for me. That, you know, I still have needs and I bring them to God, but my needs are not existential life needs. They are, you know, spiritual needs mostly, and those are still important and valid. But again, the fact that I don't need what the Israelites needed back then simply makes me grateful, and it makes me grateful that, you know, that God has shaped and formed the world to at least get to the point where it has gotten now, where there are lots of issues and conflicts and evil in the world, like I said. But in my own life, God has blessed me. So I'm giving thanks for that, and I'm being grateful for that now in this moment, because it's been brought to my mind by the fact that the psalm has these Israelites being grateful to God as well, you know, and saying, we'll recount your praise and we will be thankful to you if you help us with this. You know, the Israelites do not resent God whatsoever, even after so many bad things happen to them. And I think a lot of times it's easy for me to start to sort of feel resentment toward God if anything goes wrong in my life at all. So again, sort of a perspective thing, right? I have no reason to have any resentment against God, really. I have been given so many things and have so much peace in my life, that it's unwarranted, right? So anyways, that was just my final reflection on this passage here and what it was sort of making me think about. Maybe through my own discussion of it, it brings about some ideas or thoughts for you all. Or maybe in the way that I reflect on the Bible passage, it's informative for you all, and how you might do reflections yourself. There's so many things you can pull out of any Bible passage. For this one, I just sort of wanted to get into what actually happened in the passage itself, right? So, you know, what did we actually see here and what it like actually occurred? Perhaps a bit of historical context with it, if I know it at all, or it's in the notes, which we had it in the notes. And then once I have a good picture of the passage itself and what is being discussed or depicted, if it, you know, in the Psalms can do many different things, right? Some of the Psalms are just basically image poems that depict a little image. Some of them are almost semi-historical accounts, like this one, where it's discussing something that actually happened in Jerusalem. And some of them are kind of just riffs, almost more or less. They're just sort of, you know, someone just saying how they feel about God or something that God does. You know, David sort of just riffs in the Psalms, is how I would almost frame it for some of them. So there's so much you can draw out of the passages. I was sort of trying to do a direct analysis almost of saying, you this is what actually happened in the passage, and then sort of trying to relate it to my own spiritual situation a little bit. I do believe that in every passage that God has something to say to you. When you open up the Bible and you look at a passage, there is something that God is trying to say to you, right? And so for me, when I read this Psalm 79 and I reflect on it, I think God is saying to me, I think God is beckoning me to not fear asking him about my desires and needs, even when I feel like I haven't, even when I feel like I don't deserve them, basically, is what I get out of this. It feels as though God is reminding me that he's there even when I've made mistakes, and I feel like I'm in a situation where I don't necessarily deserve to get the help from God that he would normally give, right? Or the relief that he would normally give. And I think God is saying to me through this passage, he's sending me also a message of gratitude, like I was saying earlier. He's showing me a little bit of what the Israelites went through. And in that, he's allowing me to be grateful for the life that I have, in the situation that I'm in. So, gratitude, as well as a reminder that God is greater than our sins. God is greater than our embarrassment. And that God is willing to be there for us no matter what we have done. The Israelites in this passage, Psalm 79, seem to believe that God is angry with them and so that he's allowing things to happen. But in my opinion, I think that actually is just a misunderstanding that the Israelites have. I don't think God allows bad things to happen because he's angry. God does actually allow evil to exist in the world, and he does allow bad things to happen through free will. But the difference is that I said I don't believe God allows things to happen because he is angry or because he is taking it out on his believers, right? So that is a very big difference, actually. God does allow evil and suffering, but he does not allow it out of pettiness or revenge, right? And when bad things happen, it really actually more is because you have cut yourself off from God and now are not receiving his grace. So in the Catholic belief, whether you go to heaven or hell is dependent upon the final judgment that you receive from Jesus, right? And the final judgment is based upon whether you as a person have freely chosen to love and believe in God, whether you have chosen to have a relationship with God and have sought that out. There are complications about whether if you die in mortal sin, you go to hell even if you believe in God and things like that. But there's a very strong belief in divine mercy in the Catholic faith that essentially encompasses even, to the absolute last moment of your deathbed, you have every chance to convert and to ask for forgiveness of those mortal sins to still go to heaven. But the point being that whether you go to heaven or hell is a merit-based calculation. It is based upon the decisions and actions that you made while you were alive. But even one action at the very end of your life can redeem all of that, right? Which would just be choosing God, to have a relationship with God at the very end of your life. Even that would get you into heaven, right? Under a theory of divine mercy. So there's merit to it. When evil happens, like the Babylonians coming and destroying Jerusalem, it's not because the Jews broke their covenant previously. It's not because they were being idolatrous. or doing something that God didn't want them to do. And again, this is all in my opinion. I'm not necessarily a biblical scholar or anything. This is just sort of me talking from what I understand. But I don't believe that God allows bad things to happen because people make mistakes. And that's basically what the Jews are concerned about in part of this passage, right? They're saying the iniquity of our forefathers, please forgive it, so that, this suffering and pain will end. So that's important, very important to me, because it has to do with the justice of God and whether God is acting justly or not. And I don't think it's just to basically allow bad things to happen because your believers weren't perfect to what you asked them to do. Maybe I'm wrong, but that seems, that doesn't seem like the motivation that God would actually have there. I think it is more that God allows people to have free will. So the Babylonians, all it comes down to is that he just wasn't going to stop them through their exercise of free will, that they were going to, launch war and try to take over Jerusalem. It's not that he allowed it to happen because the Israelites did something. It's simply that he allowed it to happen because otherwise he would have been infringing upon the promise that he made, the own promise that God made to humans, which was that he would allow them free will. So God doesn't break his own promises, even when it would be to prevent evil, which is very interesting. So God never breaks his promise of free will, even if it would be to prevent someone from, killing another person or something like that, which is a difficult thing to deal with. That's difficult to wrestle with. But the point is that, people do have to make their own choices, really, ultimately. But yeah, so anyways, my personal messages from this, gratitude for my life and for what God has given me, the ability to turn to God even when I feel like I don't necessarily deserve it. And then on a general level, I really come away from this passage thinking about the differences in expectation that we can have toward God, and saying, do we expect God to just take care of every aspect of our lives and make us comfortable, or do we expect God to just give us what is necessary, basically? And so I guess you have to ask the question, what is really actually necessary in our lives? And that is a question I think only God can answer. Something that would take a lot of reflection to determine, what is a truly necessary thing in my life, and not just a comfort that I have around me to make me feel better. So, what are we expecting from God, and is that a proper expectation to have? Basically, right? That is the other sort of takeaway that I have from this. The other thought that I have when I read this. Is it really, though? I guess maybe it's slightly different from that, because it's not necessarily about the expectations that we have of whether or how much God is going to take care of us, but it's, I guess, the general takeaway from this one for me would be more about it, that this song here is getting at. It's really more getting at, like, well, now I'm sort of stumbling over my thoughts and I can't really figure it out. But let's see here. So there's this huge struggle. They're asking God for help again. And they're saying, you owe it basically to us because we honor your name, and you don't owe anything to these other nations. So yeah, I guess the general takeaway also for me is, like, it's sort of like the expectation of how much is God going to do for you, or what is like the proper expectation for how much God is going to take care of you and solve issues in your life, versus just empowering you to solve those issues. Um, so, because it seems like the Israelites here are really asking for direct intervention, not just for their armies to be successful in a resistance, right? Um, so maybe it is just about the general takeaway, I guess, for me on this one sort of isn't really about expectation. I think it's more about I don't know. I think the general takeaway actually could just be the gratitude one, because I do feel gratitude when I read through this and see the situation that the Israelites were going through, and I think that that's a common takeaway that most people could have as well. Just different circumstances within which the faith that the Israelites had and the faith which we have exists is just so different, that I am grateful that I'm able to build a relationship with God in an era that is much more peaceful, and that has much more comfort and time and an ability for me to do that and to actually build that relationship out. So I guess I'll say that gratitude, for gratitude for how far God has brought his chosen people, because I would still consider faithful believers now God's chosen people, but that is sort of an outdated term. Everyone is God's chosen people technically, because he kind of made all of us and doesn't really differentiate between the Israelites and the Jews anymore, or I'm sorry, between the Israelites and the Gentiles anymore. So I would say that that's not as much of a concern anymore, perhaps. But then the other takeaway that I had on this, the gratitude, and then also just turning to God in any time, and even when you feel like God is the one who's punishing you right now, even if that's how you feel, then God is still the person that you have to turn to in that situation. Even if you feel as though you did something wrong and you almost deserve what's happening to you, then you have to still seek the forgiveness, and then try to mend the relationship, right? So that's what the Israelites do, which is admirable to them that they do that, and it's harder than it seems, I think. I know I've been in desperate situations where I basically just want to wallow in the bad emotion or in the bad situation, and not really improve my own mental state, and just sort of stay in the funk that I'm in, right? It's actually very, very easy to do that. And the Israelites could have done that here as well. Once this bad thing happened, it actually would have been really, really easy for the Israelites to say, okay, well, God isn't protecting us anymore. Okay, so why should we care about him anymore? Why should we praise God, give him thanks, give him sacrifices, give him homage, when he lets bad things happen to us, right? So what if our forefathers did something bad? That was them, that's not us. Why is God punishing us for something that somebody else did? There's lots of reasons in this situation for the Israelites to be indignant and for them to be upset with what God is doing. There's lots of reasons for them to turn away from God and to basically flip the finger and say, you screwed us over, so forget about you, right? There's actually, it would have been so much easier for the Israelites to do that. It seems like that would have been more natural, in my opinion, as far as a general human reaction to that kind of situation. Of we made a promise with this person, we kind of screwed up a bit, and now this person is totally hanging us out to dry. Most situations, those people aren't going to be friends anymore. They're actually probably going to be enemies, right? But even in that situation where the Israelites can be very angry, they actually just still turn to God and they say, if deliver us and we will sing your praises. So they want to mend the relationship, and it takes a lot of humility to do that, I think. So that's probably my biggest takeaway from this. The ability to sort of almost get over yourself and over your own pride when you're in a bad situation and you need to ask for help. And also get over your own pride in the sense of not allowing yourself to wallow in a bad situation either. So that's sort of the first step too, right? You can't just sit there and be content with whatever bad thing is happening because you feel resigned to it or that you deserve it. Because that is a lie, straight up. That is not true. You're not actually content being in that situation. And you're actually telling yourself a lie, probably through perhaps another evil source. But either way, when you tell yourself, actually whatever, I don't care, I'm just angry, I don't care. It's not really true. You're just sort of allowing yourself to sit in that funk, which is what the Israelites could have done here as well, right? So they didn't do either of those things. They sort of buckled their pants back up and humble themselves and get right back to asking God for what they needed. And that's what you should do, actually, when you have a tough situation occur, as opposed to wallowing in the bad situation and trying to take out your anger on whatever you perceive as having caused the situation, right? Which in this case would have been God. And oftentimes we do find ourselves wanting to take our anger out on God, right? So it's something we have to be careful about. But yep, so, being humble and being willing to ask God for help, even when you feel like He's always punishing you, and then just being grateful. Those are probably the biggest messages that I get from this passage. So I hope that this was good reflection, that anyone who came by enjoyed and had a good time hanging out, maybe just had some good thoughts come up on your own about this passage or about other Bible passages. I'm going to be trying to do this more regularly, and maybe I'll pick out a series to do, maybe a book to read through and keep discussing it. I think that would be fun. But either way, I hope that everybody has a great day, and I will keep you in my prayers. Take care.